This lecture is organized by UNESCO Chair on Teacher Education for Sustainable Development at University of Ljubljana, together, of course, with Faculty of Education of University of Ljubljana. As the chairholder, I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Professor Michael Ranney. Professor Ranney is a researcher and faculty member at the Berkeley School of Education at the University of California. His research focuses on nature of explanation and understanding across both formal and informal domains. He has published in prestigious journals such as Topics in Cognitive Science, Journal of Environmental Psychology, Journal of Research in Science, Teaching Science Education, Nature, Climate Change, among others. Professor Ranney is currently in Europe on a Fulbright Fellowship and is spending his week visiting here in Ljubljana. On a more personal note, we met last year in the summer in Berkeley, where he has incredibly generously helped me connect with some people, truly inspiring people. He's one of them, and deeply curious and passionate about a wide range of topics. So I would appreciate if you take over, and thank you again for talking with us about global warming beliefs.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming. And I've really been having a wonderful time here in Ljubljana. And Ranney Clark has been a fabulous host. I got to experience more than I would have imagined. It's a fabulous city and area. So I'm so glad to be here. I guess I'll just dive in with the talk, but feel free to jump in with any questions, especially if something is not making sense. I talk pretty quickly, even to American audiences. So if my verbiage is just coming on too fast, just raise your hand and ask me to repeat something or clarify something. That's just great. And if there's a question that's like extremely complicated, I might punt it to the later question and answer period. But I'm fine with being interrupted. And so you can see here that basically my colleagues and I at Berkeley and elsewhere have generated a dozen different ways to change people's minds about global warming. And these are all brief ways. So generally they're less than 5 minutes long. So they're going to take a lot of time. You could combine them and so forth, for instance. But the main goal of them is to increase people's understanding of global warming and their acceptance that it's happening, and also their concern about global warming. And one of the keys is that we always find that we can do this without generating polarization. That is, it's not that we find that conservatives and liberals increase their acceptance of global warming to the same degree. There's no backfire effect where maybe conservatives think that we're propagandizing them or something like that. So there's a whole bunch of people who've been involved in this project. And I'll just point out to a few of them here. In green, we have some of the more recent contributors who updated some of our statistics that you'll be seeing. And I'm so happy to be here in Slovenia and so happy that Fulbright triggered this trip. So thanks again for coming. I like to contextualize my research by sort of indicating where I am in the space of science. So, for instance, one of the things that I am most interested in doing is looking at this intersection between science cognition, math cognition, especially numeracy or number sense, but also things that are really societally important. And I think that in this sweet spot here is where I think climate change cognition exists, and that's what's really interested me for the past 15 years or so. So what the talk is really about, on one hand, is that climate change science is really good, but also that there are ways we can help change people's minds. And I mean, we collectively, that you can as well, and hopefully after this talk, even more so. I do this thing that I call my night job, which is work on a website called How Global Warming Works. It's a public outreach website, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's been pretty popular. And on my day job, I've been running experiments, randomized controlled experiments, to see which of these techniques work, which ones work better than others. And what we found is there are lots of ways to change people's minds. There's not just like one particular way. So these are some of the publications that have come out in my day job, and some of these Professor Torkard has mentioned. But I should probably contextualize this in that this is a pretty US-centric talk, because the US is unfortunately pretty slow at accepting that global warming is happening or that it's concerning. And so we're not the worst in terms of generating CO2, but you can see here, for a long time, actually, Britain, the UK, was worse, and this is per capita carbon dioxide. But then after a while, the US took over around 1900 or so. Now Canada, unfortunately, have come join us, whereas China is further down, and Kenya are sort of the heroes of this story. Now, there are people that are higher than the US, like Qatar or Qatar, depending upon how one wishes to pronounce it. But this just gives you a sense of some of the international variety of the problem. Now, this is a slide that I generated for red states in the United States. So like when I give talks in Texas or Kansas or places like that, there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction to anything that has like a liberal tilt, where there's a danger of you being called a communist. So what I've done is I've generated a little slide here for such folks. I'm just showing you, give you a little sense of the environment that I sometimes work in. And one of my buddies calls this my redneck bona fides, sort of like my cowboy roots. But in spite of all this, I really like to point out that I'm a patriot. I care about the United States. But I'm also a scientist, so I collect and assess data, and that's like my primary identity. So regardless of my past, my goal is to understand the truth, like people in this room, right? So I'd like to start off empirically by showing you what it's like to be a participant in one of our experiments. This is what I'll call the Beck's experiment. And so this is your first person experience. I'm going to show you two graphs. One of them is Earth's surface temperature over time, from 1850 to today. And the other one is the Dow Jones Industrial Average, inflation adjusted, which is basically like the United States stock market, which is the largest stock market in the world. So each of these points represents 16 years of data. And I can tell you, we asked people, can you tell which is which? Can you tell which is the stock market and which is temperature over time? And the short answer to that is no. In fact, I gave this talk initially at the University of Chicago's Business School with all their fancy Nobel laureates in economics, and they actually guessed wrong. They actually guessed in the wrong direction, non-significantly, because these look very similar. And when we ask people, are these rising, or are they dropping, or are they flat? That's sort of a result that goes into the journal of everyone says these are rising. And what we do is we bundle these graphs into what I call a Beck's curriculum, where Beck's is an alien robot who's landed on Earth by accident, crash landed, doesn't know what's going on, but he grabs a radio and hears the stock market is a good place for investment as it goes up. And he'll hear that the temperature is going up, but the others say, no, the temperature is going down, the stock market's not good. But he knows if he just averages, by the magic of averaging, you can kind of tell what the central tendency is. And just by giving people these graphs and this little vignette, they appreciate that global warming is really occurring and that it's worthy of concern. So this is just one of the 12 ways. I'll be cycling through some of the other 12 ways as we go. Now, we won't have time for all of this. Sometimes I do this in like a 2-hour session, so I'll breeze through some of this. But a couple of the keys for our research is we always ask people to guess. So we don't just give people the information. So like when we ask what the mechanism of global warming is, like why we're getting hotter, we always ask people to generate an explanation, because most people can't do it. And in realizing that they can't do it, that opens their mind up for change. Likewise, when we ask people about statistics, we always ask them to fill in the blank with a number. I'll show you some examples of that later on. And the second part of the secret sauce is we tell people there are no deceptions. Unlike some social psychology experiments where maybe half of the people are lied to, we tell them you can share this with your family tonight. You can Google us later to make sure that we're not lying to you. And so those are some of the key things we do. But it's not just the United States that have the dearth of climate change knowledge. We've checked out other nations as well. And so now we're getting into the 12 ways. So this is in blue. So each of these blue things are the 12 ways we change people's minds. And one way that we do it is we done this 8 times, actually. We've replicated this several times, as have people in other laboratories. That if you just give people the mechanism of global warming, like why it is we're getting hotter, according to physicists and chemists, that changes people's minds. They learn a lot about it, and they also increase their acceptance concern. And again, we find no polarization between the conservatives and the liberals. So clearly, there's no stasis. People aren't just staying where they are. I'm using stasis theory throughout as sort of like a so-called straw man that is wrong. And we also find that there's good longevity. So, for instance, in one of the experiments I'll mention later, we tested people 34 days later on a delayed post-test, and we still found evidence that they had changed their beliefs about global warming in a good way. Another of these 12 ways, our second ways, is we just give people a little bit to read about why they should trust climate scientists. It turns out a lot of people don't know the reward structure of science, and so that alone increases people's acceptance of global warming. We also have some video of global warming's consequences. I won't talk much about that. This was mostly done in German, actually. And I want to talk about these 2 hope-related interventions. These are relatively new, but that's yet another way. Now, as I mentioned, statistics can sometimes be useful, and it comes from this realm of work that I've started called numerically driven inferencing. And basically, it's using statistics and graphs to help change people's minds about global warming. So we've done 3 different studies where we just give people a set of like 7 or 9 representative statistics, where they guess the number first, we give them the number later, and that increases people's acceptance and concern about global warming. Now, people have said, well, yeah, but what happens if, when they're done in your study, they turn on like right-wing radio and hear these misleading bits of information? So we ran a study in which we divided 50-50 between representative statistics and misleading statistics. And even then, people increase their acceptance of global warming. That is, like if they're looking at 2 different statistics, they can kind of tell which is more believable just on the basis of what it's referring to, like the 4-dimensional extent or something like that. So they can kind of discern the wheat from the chaff, even when there's this agnotological, false and misleading information. Now, we've also done some boutique sort of things with sea level rise, which I'll mention partly because they're just kind of interesting. And then this is a funky one. I have a geopolitical theory that I'll refer to later as RTMD, reinforced theistic manifest destiny. And in that, a prediction is that if you could reduce someone's sense of nationalism, it should increase their acceptance of global warming. And this would be very indirect. We don't even mention it. We don't mention global warming. And sure enough, if you just lower the nose of the average American a little bit, it increases their acceptance of global warming. And it turns out this is actually bicausal. That is, if you increase people's acceptance of global warming, it also reduces their sense of nationalism. And we're actually trying to see this replicates in another country at this point. I mentioned the Beck's graphs where we show the temperature over time and compare it with the stock market over time. And I'll also shout out this website again, how global warming works. And we've got various languages that are embedded in that website. And then we did one big study where we tried different videos as well, like from 1 minute to 5 minute, explaining the mechanism, etc. That also increases people's understanding of global warming. And I'll show an example of one of those videos later. And then we also have done more recently this thing I call carbon diluting. And it's kind of a triple entendre because it turns out that CO2, if you breathe it in, actually starts reducing your cognition a little bit. Eventually, you start losing an IQ point or 2. So it's kind of a triple entendre. There's a carbon dioxide, carbon diluting, because there are 2 oxygens, and carbon diluting, because it makes you loopy. But it turns out that just explaining this to people increases their acceptance of global warming and their concern about global warming, even though, like the nationalism, it's indirect. We don't actually mention global warming during the intervention. And again, throughout all 12 of these, we're not finding polarization. We get similar gains between our conservatives and liberals. And I'm hoping that you will come up with even better ways to change people's minds, because this doesn't have to be a small sort of cottage industry. Well, as many of you know, especially perhaps in the United States, but also in some other countries, there's some politics involved. And I mentioned nationalism as a component, and also that people aren't static. and that there's agnotology, where people are spreading false and misleading information. Well, there's some vested interest that they're trying to sow doubt about climate change. And I'm not going to mention any names, but I'm going to point to one right there. This is an industry that these are folks that actually spend a lot of money trying to reduce people's concern and understanding of global warming, unfortunately. And it turns out that it's not just them. Some candidates, I won't name any names, but last year there was a presidential candidate that allegedly asked oil CEOs for $1 billion in terms of return favors. And it turns out that 23% of the American Congress denied climate change. And get this, they're all from one party. What are the odds? Go figure. But the good news is people do learn. Societies learn, right? So it used to be that the papacy was opposed to the notion of heliocentrism, but Copernicus and Galileo eventually won out. There was a ton of tobacco money trying to convince people that smoking was benign, and eventually the science won out on that. So hopefully it'll work out this way as well in climate as it did with the planets and the smoking, and the sooner the better, right? And I think there are some people that are actually offering a false dichotomy here, where you can't change people's minds with information. You can only change their minds by changing their cultures. And I think that's poppycock, as we say. Both of those can work. You can change people's minds in many ways, information, culture, whatnot. And I think it's sort of a false dichotomy in the same way that the nature-nurture supposed dichotomy is a false one as well. And more good news is that we can readily change, we can fix global warming. So one estimate is that it's going to cost only $125 trillion to change over all of our energy systems. But if you contextualize that, we as a species, according to the World Bank, spend over $5 trillion a year just subsidizing fossil fuels. So if we'd stopped doing this 25 years ago and took that money and put it into solar and wind or so forth, we'd basically be done. So it's a solvable problem. And there are a lot of reasons for hope, and we've been running some experiments, as I mentioned, about hope. So the trouble is a lot of people are defaming scientists, and they don't really understand the motivation of what makes scientists tick. Because real scientists, as most of you probably know, overwhelmingly wish that global warming weren't true. And certainly their parents, or they care about even what they're going to eat when they're older. And it turns out that PhDs have low unemployment rates. They have high job satisfaction. They can do other things and still get good pay. And so impugning them is a form of libel. It's a passing of falsehood. So one thing I do whenever I give a talk, and I'll do it here, is I'll say that I'd be ecstatic if global warming weren't false. I would just be really over the moon happy if someone could just show that I'm deluded, and they could undilute me of this unfortunate belief that global warming is occurring. And so I always make this pledge to anyone on the planet. I say, if someone could please, show me that I'm wrong, that global warming is not happening or concerning, I'd rent the largest truck I could find. I'd drive it to wherever they are. I'd thank them profusely. I'd stop working this entirely, and I'd give back any dollar I ever got in climate change cognition. In fact, I would then write out this secret sauce, win the Nobel Prize, and split the Nobel Prize money with the person who told me. Because anyone who could debunk global warming would definitely win the Nobel Prize and be the most famous scientist alive. People would say, oh, this is the guy who made it so I didn't have to drive my car in the river. Let me buy you a beer. So you'd be very famous. And it turns out that people just don't think about this because there's a lot of misleading information about bias among scientists and so forth. So we thought, well, what if we just ran an experiment with this information? So we did. So this is, the 12 ways. This is our trust way. We published this a couple of years ago. And I'll let you read this part of it. It's just part of we had a 250-word version and a 500-word version, but you can get a little bit of sense just by reading this bit. So when you couple this with other information like my pledge and so forth, it turns out that just reading this increases people's trust in scientists and certainly trust in climate scientists. And it also increases their acceptance that global warming is happening because now you're trusting the people that are telling you what the phenomenon is. So I'm not going to do many statistics in this talk, so you just have to trust me that they're relevant and all and significant. But you can see here we actually had two conditions. One is we have a pre-test, post-test, and in between there's the short, the S there, the short 250-word version. Then there's a 500-word version. And you can see for all of these, they increased on those three variables I mentioned, including acceptance of global warming. And again, we didn't find any polarization. So liberals and conservatives were increasing just as much as each other. Now, why should you trust scientists? Well, the main reason is that they should know what they're talking about, right? So we thought it's interesting to make sure that they understand the science. So at this point, I'll move into the mechanism part. We asked people, like, how is it that Earth's getting hotter? What's the physical or chemical mechanism? And again, this has been replicated by some folks at the University of Washington. And we'll problematize it for our participants. We say, how would you explain how climate change is happening? Think about it for a while. We have them write it down. And then we say, how is it that heat has a hard time getting away from Earth's surface and troposphere, the atmosphere close to Earth? Why doesn't heat have just as hard a time getting in? Why is there this sort of asymmetry? And so what I'd like to do now actually is run a little bit of a video just to give you a sense of what our video participants look at. And we'll scooch over to that. This will be a little less than 5 minutes.
You may have heard of global climate change, which is often called global warming. Whether or not people accept that humans are causing global warming, most folks have an opinion about it. But how much do regular people understand the science of climate change? If you were asked to explain how global warming works, could you? Take a moment to try to explain to yourself how virtually all climate scientists think the Earth is warming. What is the physical or chemical mechanism? Don't feel bad. If you're anything like the people we've surveyed in our studies, you probably struggle to come up with an explanation. In fact, in one study, we asked almost 300 adults in the US, and not a single person could accurately explain the mechanism of global warming at a pretty basic level. This is seen with larger surveys that have shown that people often lack knowledge about climate change. But how can we make informed decisions without understanding the issues we're debating? Allow us to give you a short explanation of how global warming works. First, here is how Earth's temperature works without considering how humans influence it. The Earth absorbs light from the sun, which is mostly visible light. To release that light energy, Earth also emits light. But because the Earth is cooler than the sun, it emits lower energy infrared light. So, Earth's surface essentially transforms most of the visible light it gets from the sun into infrared light. Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, such as methane and carbon dioxide, let visible light pass through but absorb infrared light, causing the atmosphere to retain heat. This energy can be absorbed and emitted by the atmosphere many times before it eventually returns to outer space. The added time this energy hangs around has helped keep Earth warm enough to support life as we know it. Without this greenhouse effect caused by these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, Earth's average surface temperature will be about 50 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, which is well below the freezing point for ice. So, how have humans changed things? Since the dawn of the industrial age, around the year 1750, atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased by 40%, and methane has almost tripled. These increases cause extra infrared light absorption, meaning an extra greenhouse effect, which has caused Earth to heat above its typical temperature range. In other words, energy that gets to Earth has an even harder time leaving it, causing Earth's average temperature to increase, thus producing global climate change. In case you're wondering about what makes greenhouse gases special, Here are two sentences of slightly technical information.
This is bonus sentence.
Greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, absorb infrared light because their molecules can vibrate to produce asymmetric distributions of electric charge, which match the energy levels of various infrared wavelengths. In contrast, non-greenhouse gases, such as oxygen, that is O2, don't absorb infrared light because they have symmetric charge distributions, even while vibrating. To wrap up, we'll quickly summarize the mechanism of global climate change. Earth transforms sunlight's visible energy into infrared light, and infrared energy leaves Earth slowly because it's absorbed by greenhouse gases. As people produce more greenhouse gases, energy leaves Earth even more slowly, raising Earth's temperature even more than it has already gone up. That's how global warming happens. This wasn't so hard to understand, right? In these few minutes, you hopefully become one of the few people who understand the mechanism of global climate change. Please share this video with others so you can help them understand how global warming works too. Thanks for listening.
Indeed. Do share it with others, I hope. So it turns out that I found a way to compact that quite a bit. So I actually tried my hand at a poem. I came up with a haiku to try to explain the mechanism of global warming. And it's not very mellifluous, and it's got this apostrophe here. And you have to know that IR is infrared. But it really works to a fair degree just to explain what's happening. That Earth turns sunlight to IR light that's sponged by its spokes, greenhouse gases blood. Now, you have to unpack that quite a bit, so I'm not recommending this as a curriculum, but you kind of get a sense that it's a lot simpler than like trying to explain how an mRNA vaccine works, right? So we're ahead of the game in terms of changing minds just from the basic amount of science, I think. This is the 400 words we actually used in our first experiment, and the meat of it is here. Then there's that molecular detail you heard, and also the summary. And since I'm a psychologist, we love redundant summaries. So that's there. But one question you can ask is like, what about this science is that the climate change deniers don't accept? It seems like it's pretty straightforward, right? So it turns out that if you listen to our videos like you have, you can answer questions like, you can infer that atmospheric molecules don't know up from down, and that, for instance, you could have an inference about nitrogen. You could, because of our explanation, you could infer that nitrogen is not a greenhouse gas because it's symmetrical, right? One thing I should mention is that this is narrated by Daveed Diggs. I don't know if anyone's heard about him, but he's quite famous in the United States. He won a Tony for the play Hamilton, playing Jefferson in Lafayette. He was on our TV show Blackish. He was the star of Blind Spotting and the series Snowpiercers and Extrapolations. And I like to say that I put his career on the right track by letting him do our little videos. Made him famous. But you might think, perhaps people really do know this, and it's not rare knowledge. But in fact, even experts, like I asked someone who's about to get a PhD, an environmental scientist, very nice guy, sharp guy, but he forgot what causes global warming, even after all those years. And here, a colleague was really upset and said, "It's not all right, but I don't know. You don't understand. I've published papers about global warming." In fact, one of the people that is most known for saying that you can't change people's minds with climate information didn't know the mechanism of global warming when I was chatting with him. So it seemed like it's kind of secret knowledge. And so we thought, well, maybe it's just dusty academics like myself who don't know this. So we went off to San Diego and to parks, and we asked people that, and zero of them, not a single person, could answer this correctly at even like a B+ level, like an A or F sort of grading scheme. And indeed, not a single one of them mentioned that there was this important change from visible light to infrared light, that transformation. And most of them wrongly believe that ozone depletion was a major cause of global warming, whereas ozone is not really much of a player. And we got similar results from 11th grade chemistry students who were learning this. And we just find it odd that teachers and journalists aren't giving this knowledge to the general public. And it turns out that just correlationally, we found that there's a relationship between acceptance of global warming and understanding the mechanistic knowledge. We even replicated this in Germany as well as in the United States. This also conflicts with the idea that knowledge doesn't change your mind about stuff, stasis view. So we thought, well, gee, why don't we just tell people what the mechanism is and see if that changes people's minds, like in the video we saw. So at first, we actually just ran a textual experiment with those formed words, and we've replicated this about 7 times at this point. And I'll give you a little sense of the methodology. Some of you will be pretty familiar with this. I call it a jam sandwich methodology, where we have a pre-test, a knowledge and attitude, and a post-test. And in between is something in the sandwich. In this case, we ask people to guess what the mechanism is, and then we just give them the 400-word description to read through. So this is our very first study. And of course, we had other control groups because we're decent empiricists, and all we know that you have to take into account certain potential confounds. And this is what turned out just with some pretty relatively sophisticated undergraduates at like Berkeley and University of Texas. We found that they doubled or tripled their understanding of these 3 elements of global warming knowledge from where they started. So that's pretty cool, which also sort of conflicts with the stasis view. But we thought, will this change people's minds about global warming? Will the knowledge boost change their attitude about global warming and their beliefs about it? And sure enough, it did. So for these folks on even this initial study, we found bigger effects since then. You see, we got about a 17% gain toward perfect acceptance of global warming. And it was certainly robust. And again, we replicated this a number of times. So we showed that not only is global warming learning possible, but you can also change people's attitudes about it as well. And this, in a nutshell, also this confirms stasis theory that you can't change people's minds. So, as I mentioned earlier, we even tested for longevity. So in experiment 5 out of the 7 in this, we checked 34 days later. We still found people had increased in gains and attitudes about global warming. So it's not just something that's ephemeral and disappears as soon as they leave the testing situation. So stasis theory is not correct. This confirms it. And also, you'll see that there's not any polarization. Now, to show this, I'm actually going to show a big study that has like 1,100 participants, and I won't go through all the details of it. I'll touch on some of it later on. But basically, you can see we tested people from all different parties in the United States, even the most extreme Tea Party and libertarian folks. And right after we gave them materials about global warming, we saw an increase in their acceptance. And this was over like 18 different conditions. But not only that, 9 days later, we still found the same. So there really wasn't any difference between the more liberal and the more conservative people. Our correlation and results showed, if anything, the opposite of polarization. So again, it's good news that people aren't just turning us off because they think they're from a different tribe or something like that. Now, there is this problem with people spreading poor information, right? So, for instance, this is actually from something that a presidential candidate said, which sort of indicates that he doesn't quite even understand how gases work or how apartments work or that they're not hermetically sealed. And ozone is not a big player. There's a lot of this kind of thing. Here's another candidate who said that sea level rise will produce more oceanfront property. That's kind of strange when you think about sea level rise. It should like reduce the circumference of any land mass, right? And so one of my colleagues, Michael Mann, said that this betrays even grade school geometry. So there's a lot of information coming out of colleges that is clearly not correct. And you have to wonder, what's history going to say about these people, like in a century or something like that? We're going to look back on these people. And I shudder to think how they're going to describe these folks. That's their problem. So I'm going to shift now to some of the work on the statistics. So this is where we ask people to guess some statistics, and hang on a second. And I'll show you some examples of that. But so here's one example, and this should be familiar to you because this was actually in a video. But it turns out a lot of people think that methane is barely increased. In fact, in the video, it said that it's increased 40%. Now it's actually increased 50%, even since we made that video. But, you might find, that's methane. CO2 has gone from 40 to 50%. Methane actually has gone up from 9 to 51%, so almost tripling. And since we made that video, it's actually gone up 176%. So who knows when it'll be before it'll be more than triple in its initial. So you might imagine if people think it's 5% and they see this big number, they'd be more likely to boost the amount of money that they would spend to stop global warming. It'd be a little bit more scary. So here we ran a PB&J sandwich, where the peanut butter here is we asked people to estimate 7 to 9 really important statistics about climate change. Then we gave them feedback. We basically just gave them the number. And then we said, well, what do you think now? So we ran this study, and we'll pass these out now just so you have a glance at them. But I suggest that you quickly turn them over because we actually have the answers upside down on the bottom. So just have a quick look at them. And on the other panel, there's our 35 words. But if you switch it over, you'll see the references that relate to this talk and that support the 12 different ways we've changed people's minds quickly. But I should just shout out that we have at least 5 of these that are new, thanks to the undergraduates who've been helping me with doing this. So just as some examples, like it turns out that almost all climate scientists that are publishing believe that humans are causing climate change. In the United States, for every 100 record lows, where it reaches a record low for a particular location, we have over 200 record highs, where there'd just be 100 to 100 if there were no change in temperature. These are actually outdated. For the last 45 years, basically, every month that's occurred on the planet has been hotter than the average of the 20th century. So, there's no going back. And a lot of these are sort of riffed off of the 40 numbers that everyone should know that most people don't. And I actually generated these because I was trying to help journalists be better at their craft and better at doing scientific reasoning and numeric understanding. That was the genesis. And we've actually even found that even in Fukushima, where we ran some participants from Fukushima, they underestimate the effects of global warming. So do these surprising numbers change people's minds? They do. It increases global warming acceptance. And this is a more nationally representative sample. And again, quite significant. And we don't find any polarization. Our conservatives and our liberals are increasing their acceptance to the same degree. So this has been pretty successful. And for the size of the effect, you can see that we find about a 28% gain, and that's even 9 days after they get it. So on our delayed post-test, they're still showing a pretty good sense of the information and their acceptance of global warming. I think I'll skip that. But here is a statistic that is kind of curious. A lot of oil companies used to bandy this about because there was this period between 1940 and 1975 where there was this tiny dip in temperatures, basically nothing from a Kelvin standpoint. They made a big deal about this thing. Well, it got cooler at one point, and most people believe that this happened because we're pumping so many aerosols into the air that light was reflecting off the top of our atmosphere, and that's why it was sort of masking the underlying global warming that was occurring. But people who are agnotologists make a lot of this, and I call these the evil statistics because they're meant to mislead and cause people to not understand the truth. And as I mentioned earlier, we could take statistics like these and merge them 50-50 with our more sanely statistics, like the ones you have before you, and you'd still find this increase in acceptance of global warming that people can tell the wheat from the chaff. Like, why 1940 to 1975? I mean, why would you choose that? Why would you cherry pick that time zone, right? So if you have statistics like from 1850, there's a greater 4-dimensional breadth. So that should be more interpretable. So let me talk a little bit about RTMD. And I only bring it up partly because I think it's kind of interesting. This is a geopolitical theory that explains why Americans are different. And in a nutshell, the basic idea is that Americans have been most reinforced for thinking God is on their side. So if you think of like World War I and World War II military, and so forth, as one author wrote, he said, in 1945, the United States was the only non-wrecked major power on the planet. Like Russia had lost 50 times as many people than the United States on a per capita basis. The United States economy in 1945, it produced 50% of the entire world's industrial output. So we were feeling pretty good about ourselves, and I think we can continue that hangover. And so what this sort of represents are four constructs that correlate with each other, and two constructs that correlate with each other, this evolution acceptance and global warming acceptance. And in fact, these two correlated around 0.5. So you can make good money betting on what someone believes about one or the other if you know its alternative, its counterpart. And everything across this divide should be negatively correlated. And in fact, we found correlationally that there was a negative 0.5 correlation between nationalism and global warming. So I thought, well, gee, we could run a little experiment here where we just change people's nationalism and see if that changed their acceptance of global warming. And some of my colleagues said, oh, you can't change people's nationalism. And I said, oh, I think I can. And so how do we do that? We gave people statistics that made them feel not so good about being an American. It just lowered the nose of the average American a little bit. So these are some of these statistics. So we had them fill in the blank, and then we give them feedback. So it turns out Americans are kind of chubby. We also don't even have great internet connection. We kill each other a lot more than other people. So you get the feeling that if you do this often enough, people are less, less sort of, they're not feeling so great about their country, in this case, the United States. And indeed, we could drop nationalism by about 11%. So what happened with global warming? Indeed, it increased by about 10%. So this is yet another way we can change people's minds. And it's indirect. We don't mention global warming. All we're doing is saying, hey, here's some things about your country. And in the end, it changes their minds about global warming. And you can imagine why this is the case, like the Paris Agreement and so forth. These are international agreements. So the more nationalistic you are, the less likely you are to care about those things, whether the atmosphere is a global resource and what happens in Pakistan affects other places and so forth. And in the United States, there's often this political rhetoric of like country first or America first and drill, baby, drill that sort of directly relates nationalism with sort of anti-conservation sorts of views. So we thought that was kind of interesting. I'll circle back to the VEX thing just to remind you that we have, and these are the temperature over time versus the stock market over time. And we thought when we ran the study, like, I don't know if this is going to work. So we tried 10 different conditions, hoping one of them would work, but all 10 of them work. Every single, which is a sort of a statistical oddity, even 9 days later, each of these interventions about the temperature over time change people's minds and increase their acceptance of global warming. And indeed, the group that were the most full in their information, which is a little bit more than 5 minutes, also we found almost a 30% denial reduction of denial of global warming. And again, this is it after 9 days, so not just on the immediate post-test, but even on the delayed post-test. So if you're curious, this is one condition where we did actually 64-year moving averages. And here they're basically monotonic, both temperature and the stock market go up virtually monotonically. And again, we didn't find any polarization from these spec studies. Liberals and conservatives were increasing their acceptance to the same degree. And so we thought, well, we should really bundle these together into a website. So we've been doing this for a while. We put these together into How Global Warming Works, which we hope is a wisdom boost for the public. I won't say too much about these. Why am I not expanding? Oh, here we go. Yeah. So I'm hoping what you'll do is share this link. So when you leave today, pass along to your friends and your enemies. We've got lots of stuff going on. We've had over 1 million page views spawned by this. It's been quite exciting. They include the texts and the videos. You find our 7 compelling statistics of why you should trust climate scientists, the VEX graphs. And this is kind of what it looks like in its main page. And you'll notice we have some the videos here. So we just saw the 5-minute video. It's really like 4.5. We have videos available in Mandarin, German, and Czech. And these are the other things. And so this is the website. I think I'll skip over the cognitive science stuff about why we think it's useful, why the 5-minute video is useful. But this is where, like in a TV commercial, they say, wait, there's more. Now, how much would you pay for this with these extra knives thrown in? But as I said, we have some other languages like Mandarin and Czech and German, and we're hoping to add more, although Google Translate is getting pretty good these days. So our modest goal is to just have 7 billion unique visitors. That's all we want. We just want 7 billion people to come to our website, even if they don't come back again, as long as they get the information and go away. We don't care about repeat business. And the hope is, things like this will help yield international agreements to move along stopping global warming. So again, pass these around to everyone you know. Most of them don't know the mechanism. This is our Mandarin website. We've got Mandarin videos with Mandarin audio, Mandarin labels, and so forth. You might think, well, what does that mean for us? And I'll say, wait, there's Slovenian. Thanks to Gregor Torkar and maybe some help. We have our transcript of the video here. We also have the 400 words, 35 words, so you can even use this curricularly in Slovenia at this point. So thanks to Gregor for that. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we ran this big study with 1,100 participants, and I won't go through the pictures, but we've been trying to figure out which of our interventions are better than others, and like what's the smallest dose you can give people for it to be useful. So we even tried like just giving them like 35 words, or and that was only sort of marginally significant. But you can see that even 9 days later, we got pretty good results, and we actually sort of reduced our power here just for other reasons. And so we found good results again. And one of the interesting things is that we had a control video where we actually asked people, we gave them a video, unlike the one you saw. All it said, it had no mechanism in it. So it just said, hey, it turns out that most people don't know the mechanism of global warming, like why we're getting hotter. Isn't that too bad? We'll see you later. And then we were shocked that we found 9 days later, those people knew more about the mechanism of global warming because they Googled it. They went off on their own and got the information. We weren't expecting that. We didn't predict it. So it was kind of a cool result. And we have other cool results from that as well. But I want to just mention the real estate stuff due to sea level rise and so forth. So we gave some people lots of statistics about the economics of sea level rise, what's at risk, like Florida is sort of ground zero for bad things to happen. We also pointed out that people are already sort of voting with their wallets because appreciation for properties in floodplains is lower than appreciation outside of floodplains and sea level rise areas and so forth. So those worked as well. We got increases in people's acceptance just by giving them real estate statistics and so forth. And we also did this interesting stuff with respect to maps and sea level rise. So it turns out that if we actually have 1 degree Celsius sea level rise and it hits homeostasis, equilibrium, that means a 7-foot rise in sea level. And that contrasts with what one presidential candidate said just last year. He said that about global warming, the ocean will rise in the next 300 years by 1/8 of an inch, which is already false. We've already seen 10 times that amount. So again, this is where science and politics aren't really meshing well. And we also looked at what would happen if there was a 4 degree Celsius rise. This would be a whopping 29 feet in increase in sea level rise. So what does that mean for the bottom part of Florida? Well, it's not good. Like the Everglades are gone, all the Keys are gone. Most of the cities are inundated with water because they're on the coast. And what would happen with 4 degrees Celsius and 29 degree rise? Well, even Tampa, which might have been dry before, is now underwater. And so you see there's only a tiny bit left of southern Florida. Then we asked people, how much do you think sea level would rise if all the ice on the planet melted, like all the glaciers and the ice caps? Well, a lot of people think, maybe 6 feet or so. I mean, without seeing this, they're just guessing. They'll guess about 6 feet. It turns out that it's about 214 feet, some say 220. So it means that, the eastern seaboard would be underwater, including New York and Boston, but it'd be even worse in the southeast part of the United States. So you can see how much of the land is missing here. And one could say that like all of Florida is gone, basically what used to be called the Gulf of Mexico, that I'll call the Gulf of Biden, actually goes up to in Tennessee. So you can see just how dramatic this would be. Now, this isn't going to happen for a long time, if ever, right? But it just shows people the sense. And these sort of maps also are compelling for people in increasing their acceptance of global warming. So I mentioned that we've done some hope-related ones. I don't think I'll spend time on that, but I will remind you of the carbon dilute thing I mentioned earlier, that CO2 is not good for your brain. And so we give people a little bit of information about this, and we found that just giving them a text about 500 words of carbon dilute also increases the acceptance and concern of global warming. I did some of this research with an atmospheric scientist, climate scientist named David Romps, and a past undergraduate. And this is indirect also. So it's sort of like supra-nationalism, because we mention it being bad for your brain, but we don't mention global warming. But clearly it's another reason for people to not like CO2. So they get sense. And you can see here, Elon Musk has noticed that CO2 will eventually cause headaches and nausea, although he poo-poos it a little bit in terms of when that's going to happen. So this is the carbon dilute intervention. I've played with the fonts a little bit to help you see some things. And of course, the subjects didn't see the red or the big font or anything like that. So even though we mentioned that it's, reducing the CO2 would be good, because that would be good for a brain, we never actually mention global warming in here, and yet still it changes people's minds. Now, when I started giving this talk early, people would say, "You're just scaring me. Is there anything we can do?" And so I always put a slide in like what you can do. And I think the main thing you can do is tell your parliament, your representatives, our senators, about your climate concern, because really governmental action and intergovernmental action is going to be key. And also, I think you should vote for people who are going to inhibit global warming the fastest. And if you can give money to them and that's legal in your country, then you should do that, and I do that. More locally, some people don't like to hear this, but you might have one fewer child than you otherwise had planned. You might have even one fewer dog or cat than you planned. You can eat less meat, particularly lamb and beef are not good for the planet. Even supposedly fresh fish that's been unfrozen and frozen and so forth. Frozen fish is usually pretty good, right out of your grocer's freezer. And you can eat your leftovers. In the United States, unfortunately, almost 40% of our food goes to waste. It's really quite sad. And like I flew here, but I flew coach. And so even though I didn't have to, I was sitting there in a short seat and all that. And I'm trying to bundle all my trips so that now that I'm here, I'm trying to do a bunch. And indeed, I spent 30 hours going from Budapest to Athens and another 30 hours coming from Athens here on buses and trains, just so that I wouldn't have to fly. And it felt a little bit like martyrdom, but I'm also glad I did it, because I would be shamed by some of my friends back home if I were flying within Europe. Another thing is to avoid buying stuff that's been dug up, like gold, silver, and diamonds. You might even consider selling yours, because that'll reduce the market for it. Of course, using less plastic and less hot water is quite good. I'd say avoid cryptocurrencies. They use an insane amount of energy, like more than Argentina right now, and it's not good for other reasons. I'd say even avoid AI when you can, because like ChatGPT uses lots more than a regular Google search. AI currently uses more energy than Argentina also, and some projections suggest it's going to go up 15% a year. So if you need to use it sparingly. Also, some of my colleagues don't like this, but you can even reduce your signature line, because sometimes they just end up being in storage, right? So think of what proportion of emails are signature lines that are just dormant, sitting on computer drives that maybe don't need to be there. And also be careful with reply all, because I think only half of all messages that are sent off as reply all are read. And again, they just sit on disks and so forth. They're not so good for the planet. And then there are some classic ones, like Gardner and Stern, about buying more efficient vehicles or avoiding vehicles, insulating, upgrading your ventilation, carpooling when you can, using public transit, and getting your car as you have one tuned up and with air filters changed. So I've been going for a while. Maybe what I should just do is sort of breeze through the conclusions, and we'll have time. So just remind you of RTMB, that it's been successful. We found that global warming was linked to both knowledge and willingness to sacrifice. I didn't talk too much about that, but people will actually pay more money when they come to our experiments to stop global warming. People don't know the mechanism, but they can learn it quickly. Now, in blue here, we have the 12 different ways. So we've got 400 words. Our videos, like we've just seen one of them. Surprise is important. Getting people to estimate and get feedback is important. We got our sailing statistics. They even work when you mix them in with misleading or evil statistics. You can even change people's minds by making them less nationalistic, an indirect way. That's what we found out in the United States. The Beck's graphs you've seen a couple of times about temperature over time. We've got good longevity. We've been testing it out with other possibilities. Carbon dilution, I just mentioned, how it's not good for your brain. Why you should trust scientists. The sea level rise stuff. I didn't talk about the hope things. You'll have to trust me. And there are even other ways, like we could talk about how inexpensively it is to stop climate change, or maybe bundle some of these effects together. And probably you can come up with even better ways to change people's minds. But the key is to get to like a tipping point in all of our nations. There are 8 billion people. They need scientists and educators to help them understand this so that we can move forward into a better world. We're hoping our website, howglobalwarmingworks.org, will be part of that. And we've got other languages. Now this in Slovenian as well. And maybe I'll just have one slide that has all 12 in red of the ways in under 5 minutes we change people's minds, the text about mechanism, the associated videos, climate effects, mixing the climate effects statistics even with evil ones, reducing nationalism, showing the temperature over time, why you should trust climate scientists, videos of the consequences of global warming, sea level rise projections, increasing hope about global warming, and why carbon dioxide is not even good for your brain. And again, I'll just shout out our website, howglobalwarmingworks.org, and hope that you'll pass it along to people you know. And remind you of a haiku, and maybe I'll just stop there and say thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe we could start with some of the questions. There is one question online, as I see. Maybe for the start, I would just say my impression is that from your talk, we can say that it matters a lot what we say, what the information that we are providing. So it's not just about how we are saying it, but also what we are saying. It's very important from what I see, directly or indirectly connected with the topic. That's also something, what conclusion. But maybe we could start with the question that it's online, and then maybe some questions here in the room. So you can read it here. Basically, it's a question about how you measure global warming acceptance. So you can say a few words about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that. One of the things that is a little odd about global warming, but it's true of several domains, is that there's not just like one dimension about global warming acceptance, right? So we actually bundle in different dimensions. Usually we have like 8 different items. And they include things like, is Earth getting hotter? Just like a fundamental thought that maybe we're not even getting hotter. Or if we're getting hotter, are humans causing that increase in temperature? Or also, like, if humans are causing that increase, is this something we should be worried about? And then we have like some negatively related questions, like, I don't think it's any warmer now than it was 300 years ago. Because, in psychometrics, it's good to have negatively worded questions as well. So we sort of like use these 8 items that cover different dimensions of acceptance. And we even include like a hoax thing. So people think that it's all hoax, and they get to say that. So it's sort of a blend of different levels of acceptance of global warming, and a blend of how concerning it is, that sort of thing. And this is sort of similar to other work I did, like in the United States, about capital punishment, killing prisoners. So it turns out that there's a wide distribution. Like there's some people who think that even, Hitler didn't deserve to get capital punishment. And others, think, well, only mass murderers and something, only murderers and something like serial rapists. And, at the extreme, people who don't pay their fines, So there's, in a lot of arenas, it's really sort of this projection of multiple dimensions down to one. And so we use these 8 items, but there are probably better ways to assess it as well. Thanks for that.
Thank you. So if there is any other questions for those online, just please post them into the chat. But for others here, now is the time for any questions or comments. Please.
First, thank you for your great talk. It was very enthusiastic, and I really thought that you do this not just for a living, but with your heart. Thank you. I was wondering about how can your knowledge be transferred also to other areas? Since I'm a psychologist and we talk a lot about beliefs and attitudes and how it affects the behavior of people. And I was thinking a lot about how could we maybe take the knowledge you developed here and maybe transfer it also to other areas. So this would be my first question. Did you maybe try to use this also in other areas? And if I can just continue with my second question, would be, so here are beliefs and here is the behaviors. And I think that, and Gregor, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that global warming acceptance is quite high in Slovenia. But regarding the behavior part, I think we have a lot of things we can improve. So how to overcome this gap between beliefs and behavior?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember both of those. And you're a psychologist?
Yes.
Cognitive or some other?
Education
psychologist. I'm mostly a psychologist myself as well. And in fact, my answer to the first part is actually the reverse, that I actually started with other things and I moved to global warming more recently. So I looked at, as I was mentioning, things like capital punishment and abortion and immigration. And it turns out that in the United States, if you give people one surprising number about like abortion or immigration, it changes their understanding of the whole field. So one example in immigration is we'll sometimes ask people, what do you think legal immigration is to the United States, legal, as a proportion of our current population? And so we'll say, like, if we double every year, that would mean we'd have 100% growth every year on this immigration. And if we wouldn't even let the next Einstein in, we'd have 0% immigration. Well, it turns out most Americans think that we have about 15% immigration rate. And so, I'll say, okay, what would you like that to be? What's your preference for that? And most Americans are status quo people. So they say, well, I think things are going okay. So if I think it's 15%, I think it should be 15%. But it turns out people are wildly off on this. And it turns out that the legal immigration rate in the United States is only 0.3%. So, it's like 1/50th basically of what they think it is. So they're orders of magnitude off, 45 times, 45 times off on median. And so what happens to their preference? Do they just say, oh, well, I still think it should be 15%. I was just wrong about what's happening. We should be more immigration oriented. Or, gee, now I think it should just be 0.3% because I'm a status quo person. But in fact, most people actually go to like 1%. So they went from a status quo person to being a tripling of immigration. They kind of think, oh, we've been too restrained in our immigration, and so we should open it up. And also, emotionally, they care way less about immigration. We find the opposite thing with abortion. People are vastly far off in terms of how often abortions are done in the United States, and they care way more about that when they learn about them. So there's looking at the infinite. infinite there. So I actually started using this in other realms. And then when I realized that global warming seemed to be a very important topic, like more important to me even than immigration or abortion and whatnot, that I sort of veered to this. So a lot of the techniques I use here, I've used in the past, or I looked at evolution. Like one of the things in that RTD theory was evolution. For a while, I was looking very closely at why people in the United States weren't accepting evolution. And then I realized that there was an analog in a lot of ways. That, as I mentioned, the correlation and denial of those two is about 0.5. So, we would ask people, how do you think evolution happens? Which is a mechanistic question, kind of like we ask how global warming happens. So actually, I came to global warming after looking at other things within the realm of general reasoning and science reasoning, because it just seemed like a very important topic. And then when I realized we could change people's minds, I thought the outreach was really important. So I think a lot of these techniques do apply in other realms of attitude and so forth. Now, the other question, which is a tough one, is the relationship between behavior and attitudes, right? And this is kind of like a holy grail kind of question, because it's one thing to change people's beliefs about something, but it's another thing to change their behavior. And I think there's an elastic relationship between them. It's not a perfect linkage, but you're not going to change your behaviors if you don't believe something's happening. So for instance, I got a plane to fly here because I had the firm belief that Earth was spherical and that I wasn't going to fly off the edge of the Earth by flying here, right? And this happens to us every day. We have beliefs that changes our actions and so forth. The problem with climate change is you kind of feel like there's only so much you can do as an individual, right? And that's why one of my what you can do sort of ideas was contacting your representatives and getting them to change things, because laws and governments make us act like our better selves. Like I noticed that the EU now has this special way of putting tops onto bottles so that you don't disconnect the top from that. Some people might find that annoying, but it's better for recycling, right? And if that's something that government does for you, they say this is really better, and this may not be the best example, but you get that sense. One of the things we find is that we ask people in some of our studies, we'll say beforehand, if you had $1,000 to donate to either your favorite charity or cause, or to donate to stop climate change, how much of that money, how would you divide up that money? And we find later that people say that they would give more money to stopping climate change than they would earlier. Now, whether they would really do that, if you handed them $1,000, that's an open question. But I know that people won't change their behaviors unless their beliefs are in tune with it, because like if you, and we do this on a daily basis overall. The other thing is that there are some scientists that are actually doing this more directly. Like there are a number of people, and I applaud their work, where they're looking at energy bills, and they see if you understand more about global warming, or if you are more worried about climate, will you actually reduce your energy in your home? There have been good findings like that by Wes Schultz and people of that nature. And then there are some studies that have even gone to extreme, like in the middle of the night, they go and they measure the temperature, the pressure in the tires of people to see if they're keeping their tires inflated, because that's associated with better mileage and so forth. And so there are some that do that. And so I applaud those folks that are dealing with more direct behavior. But I think that unless you can get even a vast majority of people to accept it, like even I think Slovenia probably hasn't hit the critical mass of acceptance. Because like in the United States, 90% of Americans want better gun laws, want stricter gun laws, and yet we're not getting that in our Congress, right? But if 100% of Americans demanded stricter gun laws, then we'd have stricter gun laws, and people wouldn't be even voted in. And I think also like our stuff, our ways of changing people's minds, even our mechanism, don't just try to change people who deny evolution. It's to make people who already accept evolution even more firm in their acceptance. And that firmness causes them to be more likely to act. So a lot of people I know, especially at Berkeley, you figure they know all this. Well, they don't. And then they move along, like we measure acceptance on like a 9-point scale, and they get closer and closer to 9 points on accepting everything about global warming and concerns relevant. So it's one thing to say you accept that global warming is going on, but if you're not fully wholeheartedly about it, like you think, well, we might be wrong, maybe the scientists don't get it right, maybe we can wait a few more decades or centuries to sort this out. So it's not just kind of acceptance in a bare level, but like how much fervor you have for that acceptance. But that's a long-winded answer, but you did ask 2 questions, but thanks so much for them. Did I come close to addressing them?
Yes, some very important recollection of my memory, such as that attitude always is before the behavior, and also that it's important to have strong arguments behind it, even if you are a convinced believer that you know why do you believe your things. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one of my paradigms is like, let's say you're in a pub with someone, and you're talking about global warming, and you say, well, I'm sure it's happening. And they have to say, well, I don't think it's happening at all. And they'll say, well, why do you think it's happening? And so, well, my professors all say it's happening. And they'll say, well, yeah, but my right-wing, radio commentator says it's not happening. So there you just have like this competing authorities, if you will. But if they say, like, if you can't even explain why we're getting hotter, then why would someone on the other side even believe you? So that's like a tiebreaker that helps you become a better advocate for understanding your own position. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, like, you don't even have to remember the particulars. Like, if some people remember that it's ultraviolet lights have been infrared, that doesn't bother me so much, as long as there's this one point in their life where they knew it had to be true because they saw something. Kind of like the way I feel that Pythagorean's theorem is true because I saw it proved. I knew that it had to be true. Now, can I generate it right now? It probably, maybe not, or it'll take me a while, right? But I know that there was a moment where it had to be true, and I've just circled that as like, this is true, and I don't have to worry about that anymore. So that's another realm of it, that you can be a better arguer for those who are hesitant or denial. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Is there something I said that didn't make much sense, or I went too fast through, or anything like that?
I still have a question. Actually, I just have a wrap-up question that I promised that I'll ask you.
Okay.
So we were discussing over the weekend, and I said that I will ask him one question that I think it's relevant for any kind of scientist that it's really passionate about his work or her work. And that's, if you would have $1 billion, so we have like a little bit more than 3,000 billionaires at the moment on the planet, and the number is growing. So if you would just won a lottery of $1 billion, what would you do with it?
Well, I've thought about this, actually. In the United States, we have 2 lotteries that are called like Powerball and Mega Millions. And every time it gets to $1 billion, I will buy a ticket because I want $1 billion to try to stop climate change. And so if I did that, I would take the money, and of course they take some taxes and all that, and I would run commercials on like the World Cup and Super Bowl and basketball championships. And I'd put more of our materials up on television. And of course, it'd have to be very quick because it's like $8 million for 30 seconds on Super Bowl. And that's what I did. But I figured that I would take this money and I would put it into trying to get our information even further out into the public. So that was my that's my idea. Who knows if that would work? But we're finding in the lab that it's useful, and at least spark some conversation. So that would be my dream, is to take all that money and dump it into good advertising about why people should care about climate change and act to stop it.
Thank you, Michael, for all the insights, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon on this particular occasion when we were talking about climate change. Hopefully also in the future we will meet in similar lectures, but for today that's everything. And I hope you will all enjoy the rest of the day, maybe also thinking about climate change acceptance and action. So thank you again, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you all.